The wind was a blade against Alara's skin, sharp and relentless. It scoured the plains, peeling the last dry leaves from the skeletal cottonwoods and carrying the scent of dust and distant snow. The sky was a vast, indifferent canvas of bruised gray, pressing down on the world, on her with a crushing weight. Each creak of the wagon's weathered wheels was a groan of protest, a sound that echoed the ache in her own bones. Beside her, Helios, the old draft horse, plodded onward with the grim, resigned patience of a creature that had surrendered all hope. Alara knew the feeling well. Hope was a luxury, a fire that had been starved of fuel until only the coldest ashes remained. It had been 8 days since she had buried Thomas. 8 days since the fever had stolen the last of his strength, leaving her utterly alone in the heart of this unforgiving emptiness. She had dug the grave herself with a small camp shovel, her hands blistering, her tears freezing on her cheeks. Now the grief was a hollow space inside her, too vast even for sorrow. It had been replaced by a more primal companion. Fear. It was in the gnawing emptiness of her stomach, the parched crack of her lips, the constant, vigilant tension in her shoulders. The flour was gone. The salted pork was a memory. The water in the barrel sloshed with a dangerously shallow sound. She kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, a ruler-straight line where the gray earth met the gray sky. It was a line that promised nothing but more of the same. Her hands, wrapped in strips of linen that were grimy with dirt and use, clutched the horse's lead rope. The bindings were snug, a familiar pressure against her wrists. They were a shield, a secret, a self-imposed prison she renewed each morning. They were a reminder of what she was fleeing, and why she could never, ever stop. A shape materialized in the shimmering distance. At first, it was a mere speck, a disruption on the seamless horizon. Alara's heart seized, a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She stopped, her hand instinctively going to the heavy, rust-pocked pistol tucked into the waistband of her skirt. Thomas's pistol. Its weight was cold and uselessly solid. She knew she was a poor shot, but the feel of it was a small, desperate comfort. The shape grew steadily larger, resolving itself into a man on horseback. A lone rider, moving with an easy, unhurried gait that spoke of a deep familiarity with this desolate land. He was not a mirage. He was real, and he was heading directly for her. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the dull fog of her exhaustion. Men who traveled alone in these parts were rarely saviors. They were predators, scavengers who fed on the weakness of others. She was weakness incarnate. A woman, alone with a wagon and a horse. A prize. She pulled Helios to a halt, standing her ground beside the wagon, trying to project a stillness she did not feel. The wind whipped strands of her hair across her face, stinging her eyes. She did not blink. She watched him approach, a dark silhouette against the bleak expanse, and waited for the end to finally arrive. He did not ride in fast. His approach was measured, his big roan horse picking its way through the sparse sagebrush. As he drew closer, she could see the details that fear had blurred. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind to the texture of old leather. A low-brimmed hat shadowed his eyes, but she could feel their weight on her, assessing, cataloging her desperation. He pulled his horse to a stop a careful 20 feet away, a distance of respect or perhaps caution. He made no move for the rifle in his saddle scabbard or the revolver holstered at his hip. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind. It howled around them, a mournful, lonely chorus. He looked from her drawn face to the exhausted slump of her horse, then to the meager possessions in the back of the wagon. His gaze was not predatory. It was something quieter, more searching. "You're a long way from any trail," he said. His voice was a low rasp, like stones grinding together. Alara's throat was too dry to speak. She gave a single, jerky nod, her hand still resting near the butt of the pistol. He seemed to notice the gesture but made no comment on it. He swung a leg over his saddle and dismounted with a fluid grace. He was taller than she had thought, a man built of lean muscle and quiet purpose. He walked to his horse and unstrapped a canteen. He didn't approach her. He set it on the ground between them, then backed away to his horse. A silent offering. Her thirst was a living thing, a clawing creature in her throat. Suspicion warred with need. Could be a trick, a way to lure her closer. But his posture was relaxed, his hands held loosely at his sides. He was waiting. With trembling fingers, she unhooked her own empty canteen from her belt and walked forward, her eyes never leaving him. She knelt, picked up the full canteen, and poured its contents into her own, the sound of the splashing water impossibly loud. She did not drink. Not yet. She returned to her wagon, her heart hammering against her ribs. He watched her the entire time, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. He accepted her caution without offense. He reached into a saddlebag and pulled out a cloth-wrapped parcel. He unwrapped it to reveal a long strip of dry jerky. He tore off a piece and began to chew, his movements slow and deliberate. Then he tore off another, larger piece and held it out. Her stomach cramped with a painful, violent hunger. This was a test of a different kind. To accept his food was to accept a bond, however temporary. It was an admission of her own failure to provide for herself. Pride, a tattered and useless remnant of her former life, made her hesitate. But the smell of the salted meat reached her, and her body betrayed her. She took a hesitant step forward. He did not move to close the distance. He waited for her to come to him. With her gaze lowered, she took the jerky from his outstretched hand, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. His skin was rough, calloused. She retreated to her wagon and ate, the tough meat a miracle in her mouth. She ate slowly, forcing herself not to devour it, not to show him the true depth of her starvation. They stood like that for what felt like an eternity, two solitary figures in a landscape that had no use for them. He finished his jerky, wiped his mouth on the back of his hand, and turned his attention to the sky. "Storm's coming," he stated, not as a warning, but as a simple fact. Hard one. She had felt it, too. The drop in temperature, the peculiar, heavy stillness that had settled over the land, silencing the insects and birds. The wind had died down to an eerie whisper. He looked at the meager canvas cover on her wagon, then at her thin shawl. His gaze lingered for a second on her bound wrists. She instinctively pulled her hands closer to her body. If he found her binding strange, he gave no sign. He simply turned and swung back into his saddle. For a terrifying moment, she thought he was going to ride away, leaving her to face the storm alone. "There's a rock shelter half a day's ride east," he said, gesturing with his chin. "Wagon'll make it. If we move now." He didn't ask her to follow. He stated a course of action, one that included her. It was a choice, but not really. To stay was to perish. She looked at his back as he turned his horse, waiting for her. In the profound silence of the plains, she made her decision. She clucked softly to Helios, and the wagon groaned into motion, its wheels falling into line behind the steady pace of the stranger's horse. She did not know his name. She did not know if he was a devil or a saint. She knew only that for now, following him was the only direction that did not lead to a lonely grave. They named him Silas 2 days later, not because he offered the information, but because she heard him murmur it to his horse as he curried its coat. He spoke more to the animal than he did to her. Their days fell into a silent, rhythmic pattern. They rose before the sun, shared a breakfast of jerky and hardtack, and traveled until dusk. He taught her, through action rather than words, how to read the subtle language of the land. He showed her which roots were safe to dig and boil, where to find seep water hidden beneath dry creek beds, how to bank a fire so it would smolder through the night without consuming all their precious wood. Alara watched him constantly. She watched the way he moved, with an economy of motion that wasted no energy. She watched his hands, capable and sure, whether he was mending a strap of leather or cleaning the small rabbit he had managed to snare. He never pried. He never asked where she had come from or where she was going. He never, ever asked about the linen strips that perpetually circled her wrists. His restraint was a gift more valuable than food or water. It allowed a fragile trust to take root in the barren soil of her fear. One evening, huddled by the fire in the lee of a granite bluff, the cold was so severe it felt like a physical weight. The flames danced, casting their flickering light on his stoic face. He was staring into the fire, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. On impulse, born of a strange and unfamiliar need to fill the silence, she spoke. "My husband," she began, her voice rusty from disuse. His name was Thomas. Silas didn't look at her. He merely inclined his head, a sign that he was listening. The fever took him, back on the river. He was a good man, a farmer. The words felt like stones in her mouth, clumsy and heavy. She had not spoken of Thomas to anyone. "Farming's hard work," Silas said, his gaze still fixed on the flames. It was not pity, just a simple acknowledgement of a shared truth. "He wanted a new start," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Away from the judgment, her hand instinctively tightened on her bound wrist. The old shame, a familiar poison, rose in her throat. She fell silent, afraid she had said too much. Silas shifted, pulling his worn coat tighter around his shoulders. "This land doesn't judge," he said quietly. "It doesn't care who you were, only what you can endure." His words settled in the space between them, simple and profound. He was not offering absolution or comfort. He was offering a truth as stark and clean as the landscape around them. In that moment she understood that he, too, was an outcast. He carried his own unmentioned past, his own reasons for seeking solace in this vast emptiness. They were two solitary souls, defined not by their histories, but by their shared will to survive. The fragile trust within her deepened, its roots finding purchase in the common ground of their quiet endurance. She began to sleep through the night without the pistol clutched in her hand. The steady sound of his breathing on the other side of the fire a more potent defense than any weapon she could wield. The plains were still a dangerous, empty place, but with him there, she was no longer completely alone in it. The attack came without warning, an eruption of violence that shattered the fragile peace they had built. Two men rode out from a narrow, rock-strewn canyon, their appearance as sudden and unwelcome as a flash flood. They were gaunt and grimy, with eyes that held the feral hunger of starved coyotes. Their horses were spent, their gear in disrepair. They were desperate men, and desperate men were the most dangerous. They blocked the path, their expressions a mixture of avarice and cruel amusement. The taller of the two, a man with a scarred lip that twisted his mouth into a permanent sneer, let his gaze crawl over Alara. "Well now, look what we have here," he drawled, his voice oily. "A pretty bird, all alone." Silas had gone utterly still, his hand resting on his thigh, inches from his revolver. His body was a study in coiled tension, a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. "Keep riding," he said, his voice flat and cold. "There's nothing for you here." The second man, shorter and stockier, laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Don't look like nothing to us. We see a wagon, a horse, and a woman. Looks like our luck's finally turned." He nudged his horse closer, his eyes fixing on Alara's hands, which she had instinctively hidden in the folds of her skirt. "What's she got there? Hiding something fancy? Are you?" The scarred man's eyes narrowed. "Let's see what you're hiding, little bird." He spurred his horse forward, reaching for her. The world exploded. Silas moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his size. His revolver was in his hand, barking once, twice. The shorter man grunted, a look of profound surprise on his face, and tumbled from his saddle. But the scarred man was fast, too. He had his own gun out, firing wildly. A bullet tore through the canvas of the wagon. Another whined past Silas's head. Silas's horse shied, and in that split second of chaos, the scarred man lunged from his own saddle, not at Silas, but at Alara. He grabbed her, his fingers like iron bands on her arm, trying to drag her from the wagon seat. His breath was hot and foul, smelling of rot. "You're coming with me," he snarled, his other hand clawing at her skirt. Terror, stark and absolute, threatened to paralyze her. But then something else rose up from the depths of her being. A white-hot rage. The same fire that had allowed her to bury her husband and walk into the wilderness alone now ignited. This man was the embodiment of every leering whisper, every accusing finger, every ounce of cruelty she had ever endured. He would not take this from her. He would not take her. His grip was brutal. As he yanked her arm, his fingers caught on the linen binding of her left wrist. The cloth, worn thin from use, ripped away. He grunted, surprised by the resistance, and pulled harder. The binding tore completely, falling to the dusty ground. For a horrifying instant, the scarred brand on her skin was exposed to the gray light. At that moment, from the corner of her eye, she saw Silas engaged with the man's horse, forcing it back. She saw her chance. With a guttural cry, she twisted, grabbing the heavy iron skillet from its hook on the side of the wagon. She swung it with all the force of her grief and fury. The iron connected with the side of the man's head with a sickening crack. His eyes rolled back, his grip slackened, and he crumpled to the ground. She stood panting, the heavy skillet clutched in her hand, her entire body trembling. The sudden, shocking silence was broken only by the panicked breathing of the horses and the low moan of the wind. Silas was there, his gun still in hand, his face a grim mask. There was a dark, bloody gash along his forearm where a bullet had grazed him. He looked at the two bodies on the ground, then his gaze moved to her. It rested on her face, then traveled down to the skillet she still held, and finally, it fell upon her naked wrist and the ugly, twisted mark seared into her skin. The aftermath of the violence was a heavy, ringing silence. The two bodies lay still in the dust, stark monuments to the brutality of the land. The wind soughed through the tall grass, a lonely, keening sound, as if the plains themselves were mourning the intrusion. Alara's breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. The iron skillet felt impossibly heavy, and she let it fall from her numb fingers with a dull thud. Her gaze was fixed on Silas. He was staring at her left wrist, where the torn binding had fallen away, leaving the scar exposed for all the world to see. The brand was a grotesque thing, a symbol of intertwined serpents the town elders had proclaimed was the mark of a heretic. They had held her down, the smell of searing flesh filling the air as they burned her sin into her skin for the crime of knowing more about herbs and healing than the town doctor. It was the reason Thomas had sold their farm, the reason they had fled into the wilderness seeking a place where such ignorance could not reach them. Now it was bare under Silas's unwavering gaze. All the old shame, the humiliation, the terror, flooded back into her, and she felt a desperate primal urge to hide. She quickly covered the mark with her other hand, turning away from him. His boots scuffed in the dirt as he moved toward her. She flinched, expecting judgment, disgust, perhaps even fear. She waited for him to back away, to saddle his horse and ride off, leaving her once more to her fate. He stopped in front of her. Gently, he took the pistol from her waistband, checked it, and tucked it securely into his own belt. Then he took her arm, not the branded one, but the other, and guided her to sit on the edge of the wagon. Her body moved without her consent, her legs trembling too much to support her. He said nothing as he went to his saddlebags and returned with a clean strip of cloth and a small flask of whiskey. He knelt before her, his movements slow and deliberate. He poured some of the liquor onto the cloth and began to clean the gash on his own arm, his face set in grim lines of pain. She watched him, mesmerized by the simple, practical action. When he was done, he looked at her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice low and steady. She shook her head, unable to find her voice. Her eyes were locked on the hand she used to conceal her shame. His gaze followed hers. The silence stretched, thick with everything unsaid. This was the moment. He knew her secret now. He had seen the brand that marked her as an outcast, a pariah. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out. His calloused fingers were surprisingly gentle as they touched the back of the hand that covered her wrist. She recoiled slightly, a wounded animal bracing for a blow. "Please," she whispered, the word a raw, broken thing torn from her throat. Don't take the bindings off." It was a plea not just to him, but to the universe, a desperate prayer to keep the last of her defenses intact. To see the mark was one thing. To have it fully revealed by another's hand was an intimacy of shame she could not bear. Silas paused, his fingers resting on hers. He looked up, his gray eyes meeting hers. In their depths, she saw none of the revulsion she expected. She saw exhaustion, pain from his wound, and something else, a profound, aching sorrow that seemed to mirror her own. He had seen the ugliest part of her, the secret she had guarded with her life, and he had not fled. But the cowboy did. With an infinite, heart-stopping gentleness, he slid her hand away. His thumb brushed over the raised, ropey scar tissue of the brand. He held her wrist, turning it slightly to see the full, cruel shape of it under the cold gray sky. He looked at the mark, truly looked at it, his expression unreadable, a mask of stone. He looked at the evidence of the pain she had endured, the cruelty of the world she had tried to escape. He looked back up at her face, at the silent tears tracking paths through the dust on her cheeks. And he was silenced. A quiet awe, a terrible and tender understanding, seemed to fall over him. The brutal violence of moments before, the harshness of the land, the words he might have said. All of it was stripped away, leaving only this raw, profound moment. He understood, in a way that needed no language, the depth of the wound she carried, a wound far deeper than the scar on her skin. He saw not a heretic or a witch, but a woman who had endured the unthinkable and had somehow kept walking. The sheer magnitude of her resilience, her quiet, desperate fight for dignity, left no room for words. Then he did something that shattered the last of her defenses. He lowered his head and pressed his lips to the brand. It was not a kiss of passion, but of reverence, an act of grace, an acceptance so complete and unconditional that it stole the air from her lungs. He was not trying to erase the scar, but to honor the survival it represented. When he raised his head, his eyes were clear. He released her hand. Wordlessly, he turned and began the grim task of dealing with the dead, his movements efficient and imbued with a new, somber purpose. Alara sat on the edge of the wagon, her wrist bare, the skin where his lips had touched tingling with a strange warmth. She watched him, this silent, stoic man who had seen her deepest shame and had answered it not with words, but with a gesture of profound humanity. The wind still blew across the plains, but for the first time, it did not feel like it was trying to erase her. The sky was still gray, but a sliver of pale light was breaking through the clouds on the far horizon. A new start. She stood up, her legs steady now, and went to help him.